So the engineering aspect is starting from the kernel, understanding the problem, answering the questions the best you can, finding out those questions that you're trying to answer, develop more questions, figuring out how to answer those questions, and then iterating toward a better solution over time.
How do engineers and technologists contribute to effective, evidence-based government policy? Well, today's guest, Ryan Ritterson, has spent the last 10 years doing just that by assessing the risks from emerging biotechnologies, contributing to improving the evidence base underpinning biosafety, and much more. Ryan is the Executive Vice President of Research and a partner at Gryphon Scientific, a life science-focused consulting firm seeking to improve government policy through solving complex problems affecting public health and safety. Welcome back to another episode of Engineered for Impact, a podcast helping engineers learn and think more about how they can have a positive social impact with their careers. In this conversation, we cover Ryan's journey from studying computational engineering science to doing his PhD in the life sciences space, and then ultimately finding his way into working on the policy implications of life science research with Gryphon Scientific. We discuss what it's like to work at a mission-driven company, how Gryphon Scientific is improving the evidence base underpinning biosafety, the role that government contractors play in creating evidence-based government policy, and tips for getting into the government policy space as an engineer. We conclude with some musings on the future landscape of reducing biorisks, including the possible implications of AI. As always, you'll find show notes with valuable resources related to this episode at engineeredforimpact.show/Ryan. That's RYAN. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague. And without further ado, here's Ryan.
My name is Ryan Ritterson. I'm the Executive Vice President for Research at Gryphon Scientific in Tacoma Park, Maryland. My role is to supervise all of the technical staff that are out supporting the projects that we do for all of our clients. In the time not spent in that executive role, most of my work is spent in two areas. The first is focused on improving the evidence base underlying biosafety. So biosafety being the field that seeks to prevent the accidental harm caused by biological materials. And myself and others at Gryphon have noticed that the evidence base underpinning biosafety leaves open a lot of research opportunities. So working to gather those data, tackle those opportunities, and the hope is translate the results that we find into improvements in biosafety. And the other area that I focus in is in biosecurity, being the prevention of the purposeful harm caused by the misuse of biological materials. There, most of my work focuses on mitigating the risks of emerging biotechnologies, but with a much more recent focus on AI, which I think is true for a lot of us in this field and others around the world.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm really interested to dive a bit deeper into the biosafety and biosecurity aspects. But before we sort of get into that, before you got to where you are now, you started off with an undergraduate degree in computational engineering science and then did your PhD in biophysics. So I'm curious if you could take me through the journey from studying to what you're doing now today at Gryphon.
Yeah, it's a fun story. I certainly had no intention of ending up where I am now, despite how happy I am in my role. When I left home and went off to college, I had a totally different vision for myself. So to tell you the whole story from the beginning, I always knew I wanted to be an engineer, really interested in solving problems, taking problems, breaking them apart, finding a solution, and addressing that challenge. So sought to be an engineer, really loved computers growing up, loved playing games, loved building them, loved a little bit of programming, and applied to a number of computer science and electrical engineering schools. The school that I applied to and eventually matriculated at had a major called computational engineering science. And I checked the box on the application thinking it was computer engineering and science, which was the acronym used at other universities. Received my acceptance letter, was very excited, agreed to show up. And then later, reading the letter over and over again in excitement, as I'm sure many folks have, found that it said computational engineering science and wondered, wait a minute, is that what I thought it was? And it turns out it wasn't. At the school that I went to, it was the major that I intended to apply for would have been electrical engineering and computer science, so EECS rather than CES. And I emailed the school and I said, hey, I meant to apply for this major, not the one I'm in. Can I change? And they said, no, you can't change now. You can show up in a year. You can apply to change majors. And if your grades are good enough, we'll consider it. So I'd already declined all the other schools, was kind of locked in, and was still happy about the school that I was going to, decided to matriculate and arrived and found that computational engineering science is, despite the similarities in name, quite distinct from computer engineering and sciences. So computer engineering and sciences is about making better computers, making computers do more advanced and different things, right? It's really about the design and implementation of computer systems. Computational engineering science is the use of those computers to solve engineering and scientific problems in other disciplines. So rather than making a better computer, it's about making better bridges or making better proteins or solving scientific challenges in astrophysics using computers. And I found after my first semester in college, really found the major that I was in intriguing. And after the first year, decided to stick with it rather than try to apply for the electrical engineering major. So sort of first diversion off of my intended path. After a couple years in my program, my faculty advisor at the time advised me to get involved in research. Really thought that getting involved in research while in college would help my job prospects, would help me, better understand what I wanted to do and just sort of overall improve my career prospects. So I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do with computers, did a wide search, applied to, spoke to a professor in the mechanical engineering school who was building what are called MEMS, so micro electrical mechanical systems, very tiny nanometer scale mechanical devices. Talked to some other professors, and then talked to a professor that was working on computational biology. And that blew me away after talking to her. I must admit that, pre-college, biology to me was a phenomenological science where you sort of looked at the world and wrote down what it looked like and kind of artificially built relationships, right? This is what, these animals go in this bucket because they look like this. These plants go in this bucket because they look like this. This is what a cell looks like. And when I got to college, I found out, biochemistry, cell biology, developmental biology, biophysics, computational biology. It was a much more hypothesis-driven science than I had realized, and really fell in love with the life sciences because found that there were so many unanswered sort of fundamental questions around biology that, in comparison to physics and chemistry, which really had their dawn and their renaissance early in the 20th century, the life sciences was about 100 years behind. So really committed to the life sciences. After doing that, decided that probably if I wanted to continue on in the life sciences, I would need to get an advanced degree because I had a computational engineering degree, not a life science degree. And became fascinated with two specific things in biology. The first is the protein folding problem, which is understanding how the sequence of amino acids that make up a protein determine the three-dimensional structure that it folds up into, which gives each of the proteins within our body and in all living systems their function. And it's a massive multidimensional problem that I will say in the 20 intervening years, we've made massive investments in and improvements in, but at the time was a big mystery. And that in the inverse problem, which is even more intriguing for me, which is protein engineering, right? So protein folding is you have the sequence, what's the structure? Protein engineering is I want a protein that does X with this structure. What does the sequence have to be to get there? And protein engineering was really at its nascence at the time that I was looking to go to grad school. So I went to grad school as a protein engineer, intended to be a computational biologist and really advance algorithms for designing proteins. Spent about a year, and then coincidentally, as part of a course that I took, we had to develop interesting wet lab experimental and engineering programs. Like we were supposed to come up with an idea and describe what the next research would be in order to achieve the objective. Did that, and the professor whose lab I was most interested in really liked the idea and pitched it to me as, hey, you could go to grad school and actually work on this idea. And at that point, I had essentially zero wet lab training. We were all required to do a 1-week boot camp where I found it really intriguing, but had basically no skill and made a ton of mistakes, and as anyone does when they're first starting how to do something. But based on the faith of the the supervisor, the professor, decided to jump into it. And that was my transition from computational work to wet lab science work, which was the second diversion in my career. Spent about 7 years at the bench in grad school, and as part of that, discovered the field of synthetic biology. So synthetic biology is generally the field of biology that seeks to make living systems more engineerable so that we can achieve objectives, understand the fundamental rules, and bring about the kinds of inventions and improvements in human life the way that we're able to with physics, with the mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and also chemistry. And so really dove into that community, found a group of people that I really loved being a part of. But synthetic biology being rolled into genetically modified organisms and fears that we may use the technologies that we develop in a way that doesn't benefit the most people. There were some implicit policy questions built into synthetic biology. And I found in the third diversion of my career, the discussions around those policy questions and the relationship between the scientific enterprise and public policy and the public good really interesting. So began to get involved in those questions. And as I was working on finishing my graduate degree, really sought to find a way to get involved in those conversations, but really sought to find a way that I could use the educational background and the training that I had while still getting involved in policy questions. And through a stroke of fortune, was able to find Gryphon Scientific, the firm that I work now, and took an opportunity there. And really, the rest is history. It's been the thing I've most loved doing. I've been there for about 10 years now, and I think it took me 3 major career diversions to get there, but this is where I want to stay.
That's incredible. I think for me, there's a lot in that story that I can kind of relate to, especially the sort of looking at the life sciences and realizing that there's just a bunch that's yet to be discovered. And there's sort of like a frontier here that you could really be at the forefront of and help push forward. That was kind of the feeling I had when I came across fluid mechanics in my undergrad, because there's so much in fluid mechanics that just isn't well understood. There's so many black box processes that no one's had, or people just haven't had the time or the means to investigate yet. So I think similarly with the development in computational abilities and resources and access has been able to accelerate the life sciences field, it's a similar sort of thing that I sort of noticed in fluid mechanics, where you start to be able to do these large-scale simulations following sort of the fundamental equations governing fluid mechanics. And it's just like this new frontier that's being able to be pushed. I'm curious though, what
I just wanted to say, I remember I had to take basic physics in college, and we did a little bit of fluid mechanics, and it was like, presume there's a perfect sphere and a perfect laminar flow, and this is what happens. And it was like, okay, cool, but what about the 99.99% of things that are not that what happens? And it was sort of like, nobody knows. We're just going to focus on this tiny part that we do know.
Yeah, it turns out you just need to collect a bunch of experimental data or simulation data and then try to reason with uncertainty from there on out. Or at least that was my experience throughout my PhD.
Yeah.
I'm curious what it sort of felt like, sort of finding. It's really interesting that you've kind of gone through quite a few phases to arrive where you were at today, and you said you really enjoy it. So what has that sort of feeling been like? Like what's it felt like over the past 10 years to sort of to be in the role that you're doing, in terms of, I guess, from a satisfaction standpoint? And are there any key elements of the work that you're doing that you think drive that level of satisfaction?
Yeah. So there's 2 halves to that question. So the first, and this is something that I realized earlier, is, I went to college to become an engineer. I took a couple of detours and spent 10 years as a scientist. But really, fundamentally, I'm an engineer. And I learned that near the end of my graduate career, as I was starting to look for jobs, interestingly, through my wife, girlfriend at the time, who is the consummate scientist. She is just 100% scientist through and through. And I realized I was an engineer in contrast to her, and she actually became more committed to science in contrast to me. and this is a major generalization, but it really works for the two of us, which is scientists want to discover. They want to find something that no one knows about and be the first to find it and the first to describe it and the first to poke it and really just the first to explore it. Whereas engineers are problem solvers, right? We take the problems that we see in front of us and we want to build solutions to surmount that challenge. And there's a lot of overlap in those two things, but fundamentally what motivates someone to be highly involved in their work is pretty different. So discovering that I was an engineer and not a scientist, or rediscovering that I was an engineer, was pretty key. And it's been really satisfying to work for Gryphon because as a consulting company and a government contractor, we're problem solvers. That, in comparison to scientific grants, the work that comes to our feet is well described, time-bound, specific objectives, problem statements, right? And I love that as an engineer. But the second thing that really keeps me going about Gryphon is I think the approach, and I'll say verve, that the company has, which is we're generally a bunch of life scientists trying to solve challenging problems in the life sciences that affect public policy and health and biosafety and biosecurity. But we don't focus and define the problems that we work on by a topic or a field or an approach. We define the problems that we choose to work on by the impact that they have on people's lives. So that we really like to work on problems where we think our influence can be meaningful in improving lives. And I've seen folks at Gryphon, myself included to a degree, come in one lane, discover whether at Gryphon that what really gets them going is working in other lanes and having the freedom to sort of flex around that, where the mission is central and the topic is secondary, and that's what really keeps us going, and that's what's been really rewarding for me.
Yeah, I love that, as the mission is central and the topic being secondary. I think that speaks to me on quite a deep level of just focusing on sort of the topics you're actually doing and the problems you're trying to solve are really a means to an end of creating impact in the world and positive impact. So I guess this leads in quite nicely to asking you what Gryphon Scientific does and sort of the types of projects that you take on as an organization.
Yeah. I wish I could say it in 4 words, but I'm going to have to give you a longer explanation. So Gryphon Scientific is a consulting firm. We're a life science focused consulting firm. So we work at the behest of our clients to solve the problems they bring our way. That's sort of the fundamental essence of consulting. Being life science focused is a little bit unusual, where most of the folks that work for us have a life science background. Not all of them, and life science isn't exclusively what we work on, but it's been the niche we've been able to grow and sustain the longest. And as our founder likes to quip, we do everything for the federal government related to the life sciences, the U.S. federal government, I should say, that doesn't involve a laboratory. So we have no wet lab space. We don't do any direct experiments, but we do sort of a mix of everything else. So anywhere that a life science technical background can really help improve the federal mission, solve federal challenges, is where we like to be. We'll give you a couple examples of the work that we work on, largely, most of them not my own. We support the National Institutes of Health in the U.S. On the collection of data related to infectious disease surveillance. And our role there is to support another company that does all of the basic IT infrastructure work to build the resources that can collect and store the data. And then we work directly with the scientists to help them get their data into the system, make sure that it's properly organized, make sure that it's properly described, and therefore can be turned around into a data resource that's useful for the broader scientific community. We do a lot of work for the Department of Homeland Security in the United States, analyzing emerging technologies and the potential risks that they may cause, and also often the benefits that they may bring about to the federal mission. Right? So doing the analysis of both sides. It's not just looking at the bad or not just looking at the good, but doing both, helping them understand, at first glance, you may think that technology is going to be able to do, this much. But when you dig into it and you really understand the fundamentals of the technology and the sort of unanswered scientific and technical questions that surround it, in the short term, maybe it can only do, this much, and that's not a bad thing, right? Uh, it's there can be major improvements made in a narrow space, but when you have to think about how to address this challenge, it's much harder than thinking about how to address this challenge. So a lot of the work we do is technical analyses to really help the federal government focus in on where they really need to keep their attention. And it's just as rewarding for us to tell the government, hey, actually, you don't need to care about that, as it is for us to tell them, hey, actually, this is really important. You should spend a lot of attention on this. Um, One other example, we've done work for the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We did a survey of diagnostic laboratories in the United States to understand their capacity to take on additional testing burden in the wake of a widespread chemical or biological incident that was essentially national in scope. I think almost all of us can immediately remember a biological event that was international in scope where diagnostic testing was suddenly this massive need that everybody required. The real fun part about that project is we started 2 months before COVID. So it was created, designed, set out with COVID not on anyone's mind. And before our survey could go out, COVID hit, everything changed. And we were incredibly fortunate that we could actually launch this survey into these laboratories in the middle of COVID. So we got like the best real time on the ground data you could get through, it's a bit macabre, but a stroke of fortune for our work, a stroke of misfortune for the world. And the US government has taken that data and built a plan for how to operationalize partnerships with the diagnostic lab community. And we're currently doing some follow-on work to engage in that and bring that to life.
That's fascinating. Was there anything, I guess, at the time that you were ideating and designing that survey, it was all very theoretical, the sort of the circumstances in which it was going to inform policy. I'm curious if there's anything that, in light of the COVID pandemic, is there anything that sort of translated really well from idea to practice or to reality, or things that didn't translate as well?
Yeah. I would say that we focus. So I'll start with the second part, things that didn't translate as well. We focused really heavily on understanding all the technical capabilities of these facilities, what equipment they had, what tests they could run, how many tests they could run, their level of biosafety, right? So the severity of disease that they could handle in the laboratory safely. And that was useful. And it wasn't a loss that we focused on that, but the stories that we heard, having the opportunity to engage directly with some of these folks during the survey, is that in reality, the human capital was incredibly important. That these folks were as mission driven as anyone you can imagine, where they devoted their entire lives to keeping these facilities running, to adapting and being flexible to what was in front of them in order to be able to continue on with the diagnostic testing that was so critical to ensuring the safety and security of people worldwide. And we weren't really thinking about that and weren't really able to measure that directly. But there were other questions around the nature of the relationship between the government response and the private response, and what the private institutions would need from the government in order to be successful. And there had never really been, until COVID, that kind of relationship built, at least in the United States, where there hadn't been a broad scale national event since the real development of diagnostic technology, period. And for all the events that had occurred in that timeline, it was largely handled by the federal government. So the 2001 anthrax attacks in the United States, largely handled by the federal government. There was a little bit of private testing done in the Zika outbreak that hit the southern United States, but it was largely, once again, the federal government. So it's all theoretical questions about, what would you need? What would it look like? How would this work? Then we launched it, and then we got to find out in real time the decisions the federal government had made in scrambling to build those partnerships. How well were they working, and what could be done better next time? And those just bore a ton of fruit for us, which was really exciting to see.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm curious, I guess, to go back to a little bit around the the idea of biosafety and biosecurity. I think it'd be interesting to sort of touch on some of the examples of work you've done there, and perhaps tie that back to engineering if possible, and sort of talk about where engineers might be able to get involved, whether it's in the consulting field or sort of more broadly speaking in the biosecurity and biosafety fields. So I guess let's start with biosafety. What are some of the examples of the work that you're seeing there and that you're particularly excited about, or the work that you're doing or have done with Gryphon where you think engineers could be involved?
Yeah. So I'll say as a preamble, and I kind of mentioned this before, but the nature of our work is to be handed really challenging problems that don't have easy answers, right? If they had easy answers, the government wouldn't be seeking outside help to address them, right? And that's not to toot our own horn, right? There's plenty of peers we have across the federal contracting space that do great work too. But the problems that we tackle are challenging, complex, sometimes vexing. And unlike scientific discoveries, which need to be peer reviewable and need to be essentially unassailable and reproducible in order to build the foundations of science forward, we have to solve the problem in the best way that we can in the time that we have available and the resources given to us. It's a really different environment. And fundamentally, that is engineering, right? You have to solve this problem the best way you can. Here's your time limit. Here's your resource budget. You also have to be able to break a large, sometimes what sounds like an intractable problem, into steps that are tractable, that you can build a plan of how to get from A to B. You don't have to go A to Z in one jump, but you have to get A to B to C to D to E and so on. That's also fundamental to engineering. So I would say, broadly speaking, in the contracting space that we work in, an engineering background and an engineering mindset is always valuable. But within the topics that you mentioned, biosafety has been really interesting. We've been focused on, among other things, building quantitative models to assess risks, which is another thing that engineers are often asked to do, right? Understanding whether the risk of a particular solution meets the standard required, whether that's a laboratory, whether that's a bridge that's being built, et cetera. And in building those models, we've had to be able to reduce what seems like a very complex sort of enumerate laboratory environment into a series of discrete things that have measurable risks. Now, of course, that's not going to give you, 6 digits of precision in risk, but that's not what needed on our projects, right? Our projects is to sort of understand at a 1 or 2 significant figure degree, where does risk lie and what improvements could we make? Really proud of the model that I and others helped build back in 2015, which was for the gain of function controversy, which I'm happy to go into in depth, which was a national and internationally infamous controversy that Gryphon was involved in, and have begun to advance those models from there. And so the engineering aspect is starting from the kernel, understanding the problem, answering the questions the best you can, finding out those questions that you're trying to answer, develop more questions, figuring out how to answer those questions, and then iterating toward a better solution over time. So it's a little bit different than your sort of one and done engineering solution. Let me work on this next thing. It's more of a step-by-step process toward an overall optimum solution.
Right. So it sounds a lot more like doing a deep dive into that field and really kind of getting to the center of the issue, and then sort of building your way back out and sort of iteratively coming back out to how to just like improve this field more generally.
That's right. And it's been a rewarding experience for us. We got involved, we tried to build these quantitative models. There's these sort of fundamental basic questions that are unanswered in biosafety. We don't know how often accidents happen in biological facilities. We don't even know the nature of those accidents. We have anecdotes, right? When something goes really wrong, it gets reported. If it goes really, really wrong, it gets reported and might make it into a national newspaper. But there are minor things, small accidents or near misses that occur with more frequency, and there's never been a comprehensive attempt at categorizing and inventorying those. And as a result, it's really hard to estimate risk because something has to start going wrong before any risk can really be realized, right? So if you don't know what your initiation parameters are, it's really hard to measure the entirety of the system. And, for your listeners, I don't want anyone to be afraid that, oh my God, there's this like unmeasured massive number of accidents happening in biological laboratories. That's certainly not the case. Biological work is conducted in thousands of places across the United States safely every day. But other industries have really realized that gathering safety data is fundamental toward making transformative safety improvements. And the two examples that I'll give you are the nuclear power industry, which has done what are called human reliability assessments, where they just watch people do their jobs and record every little thing that happens and have these great, fine, good measures of how often when person A tells person B to push button C, do they push the right button versus push something else, right? And that leads you to things like A tells B to push C, and then person B says, you told me to push button C, right? You do that back and forth to confirm the right action, and that drastically reduces the chance of an error. The other major area is aerospace, where since the dawn of aviation, we've seen many order of magnitude decrease in the risk and consequences of accidents, to where a couple of years ago there were no deaths on Earth due to commercial aviation, which I think is a pretty stunning achievement. And that's largely been fostered by this great culture of safety among pilots, fostered by the setup of a reporting system in the United States, where pilots are encouraged to report every little thing that doesn't go according to the way they expected. And if they report it, then they cannot lose their license as a result of the consequences of that mistake. And so you see all kinds of things reported into that database. And it's been in operation for long enough now that there's whole generations of pilots that have been raised in that culture and just sort of instinctively report everything. And with that degree of reporting, there's all kinds of solutions you can develop that are way in advance of an accident happening. So one example I can give you, and I forget the details, I apologize, but a couple of decades ago, one of the airline manufacturers added a new system to their aircraft, and they wanted to add a activator button in the cockpit for it, but there wasn't space, and so they added the function to an existing button. And the way that it worked was on the ground, that button did one thing, and in the air, it did something else, because the two systems, one only operated on the ground and one only operated in the air. And I forget which one was added second, but what happened was pilots didn't remember it now had a dual function. And so when the new function was added, when that alarm would go off, they would say, this doesn't make sense because the system isn't supposed to be working in this part of flight, and they would just disable it. And then they would write down, alarm went off for no reason, don't understand it. And after a number of these reports, it was quickly realized that, hey, people don't know what this button is doing, and the U.S. government forced a redesign of the system so that those buttons were separable so that pilots could understand. So back to biosafety, right? We're sort of in the 1950s, comparable 1950s aviation story in the life sciences, where we're doing it safely, it's making huge improvements in everyday lives, but there's really just this wealth of data that really could be gathered and be used to develop all kinds of new engineering solutions to challenges and gaps that we're not even aware of yet.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I'd seen, or you had mentioned to me previously about this quantitative model for estimating risk of accidents in labs, and I kind of didn't quite grasp what the impetus of that was and why Gryphon Scientific decided to take that on as a project. But I think now I've got a better understanding of that. It really is just trying to sort of be the first point of contact, or that early warning sign that there is a chance that something could go wrong in the future if things aren't improved. But in order to even discover those things, you need to have some sort of detection mechanism in place.
That's right. Yeah, and when we first built that model, it was to solve a particular challenge, which was, what is the risk of this kind of research? So we set about to build a model the best way we could to answer that question, and we did. But it was in building that model that we realized, like, oh, we need to find this number. That's got to be, everyone's got to know what that number is. Let's look it up. And it's like, nobody knows that number. Like, how can nobody know that number? Okay, let's find 10 experts and call them, and they'll tell us what the number is. We must not be able to find it. No, nobody knows what that number is. And from there, being the mission-driven folks we are, deciding that like, okay, we built this model, great. We answered the government's question, but like this cannot stand. We cannot live in this situation and have agitated and begged and prodded and cajoled and educated and have begun to build a business around empirical biosafety studies and the gathering of that data to answer that question, which has been incredibly rewarding, to having sort of the freedom to not only take what the government says we should do, but also be able to turn around and tell the government, hey, actually, this is really important. You should focus on these issues. We think that it's part of your mission space. And it's something that we have the opportunity to do there with biosafety as well as the work that we do.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think for me, like it seems like it's not a trivial thing to discover this issue that is very aligned with your mission and that you detect as just something that no one's really taking care of, and then create payable work or billable work around that. So have you got any thoughts on people or suggestions for people who maybe have identified a similar sort of gap in the way things are being done in certain industries, on how to sort of turn that insight into employable work that they can then actually sort of dedicate the time to doing because they're actually getting paid to do it and fix the issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, I don't want to sugarcoat it, and I would say it's a challenge. We were fortunate that we had other work to keep us busy for the many years pushing people to pay us to do this. But if I had to break it down into a repeatable process that I would advise others to take on, I would say, once you think you've identified one of these gaps, find experts, and a lot of them will be willing to talk to you because they love to talk about the work that they do, and gut check with them, does this gap actually exist? That was the first thing that we did, is we talked about safety professionals, and they all said, yeah, there just isn't this data. And we all know that we need to get this data, but no one is working on that right now. And that really gave us the really enhanced our motivation to want to tackle this problem, where other experts who had been doing this for many more years than we had felt similarly. From there, it's figuring out, who cares the most about this problem. I think everyone should care that we don't have the data that underlies biosafety, but the degree to which you care obviously varies based on where you are, right? So, everyday folks that are not in the life sciences should definitely care less than people that are working in laboratories. And what we decided to focus on first was finding the federal government agency responsible for caring about this problem, which is typically what we do, right? If we have a challenge or a topic we want to work on, we find the federal government agency responsible for this problem, try to find someone in that agency that we think might have a component of their job responsible for this mission, and kind of go talk to them and see what they think about it. Interestingly, with this particular challenge, we found that there is no federal agency that has biosafety as their primary mission. It's sort of torn into 100 pieces and scattered throughout the federal government, which has made it difficult to coalesce major efforts toward biosafety through the federal space. So from there, we broadened our search and looked at outside philanthropies and other funders who may also care about this issue. And that question was what intersected Gryphon with the effective altruism community for the first time, where our theory was, it's not probable, but if we don't maintain good knowledge of biosafety and we leave open this residual risk, the worst case scenario of that leftover risk could be catastrophic, right? And that is, many of your listeners are probably familiar with effective altruism, given the topic of the podcast. But it's really about, if you're going to be philanthropic, how can you get the biggest return in the world for the dollars that you're spending? And we were able to persuade them that yes, in fact, it wouldn't take a ton of funds to make a major difference in reducing what could be a catastrophic risk. And then from there, with that original nucleus of funding, we were able to prove our idea, where, in fact, it did not take, compared to lots of basic scientific research, a ton of money to make some progress. And once we had examples and proof principle of that, we could go back to the rest of the stakeholder community and say, hey, did you see, like, and I want to say we didn't conduct the work. We were fortunate enough to receive the grant and then re-grant it to organizations around the world who have laboratory spaces, which was really fun. We got to work from folks from Jordan, Brazil, Mexico, a couple places in the United States, and say, look, these sites love doing this work. They find it very meaningful. The experiments are relatively easy to design. Conducting them is relatively easy. And the results that you get are just super meaningful toward biosafety. We should do more of this. And that's started to get traction, right? So it's a step-by-step process of proving the nucleus of the idea, finding a champion, proving the idea further, and then broadening your approach to that after that. And you have to be okay with people saying no. That if you probably won't be able to go through that, you won't be able to find one person who gives you that first step, and then your second person will give you the second. It's probably going to be 50, 75 people in the first step, right? 100 people in the second step. But if it's something you're passionate about and you truly believe to be true, keep at it.
It's an amazing story, really. So you go from that, I guess, to sort of summarize it, it's starting off with clarifying the need and talking to experts to understand if the need really exists. Then it's figuring out who's bought in on caring about if that need is solved, and identifying basically who could fit the bill to be able to sort of do an MVP, minimum viable product type experiment, basically to understand if you can actually solve the need. And then assuming that you are able to show that, then you kind of work upwards from there of targeting, going back to government and showing that, yes, this is something that it is a need. We're able to solve it. It's actually not that expensive to solve compared to some other sort of reference case, and then sort of building backwards or back up from there, basically.
That's right. Yeah, and that last step of, hey, it's not that expensive, you should focus on that. That was a fulcrum upon which we could motivate the government stakeholders to take interest in this idea, but that doesn't have to be true, right? That if it's going to make a small difference and cost an absolute fortune, you're going to have a really hard time. But there are things that are cost a fortune and are still really worth doing. So I wouldn't let that sort of amplifier necessarily be the determinator. And I would also say, don't be afraid to be wrong. That if you have a good idea, it's probably not going to be the only good idea that you'll ever have. And you might have a good idea, and then you reach out to experts and you find out that problem's actually been solved, which is great if it's been solved, right? Or it may turn out to be not the problem that you thought it was, and you put it down and it's just not of much interest to many. That's okay too. Don't get discouraged just because the first idea that you have or the second idea that you have doesn't pan out.
Yeah, that's really valuable advice. I guess in this sort of the broader context here, I wonder if you can comment on the role that government contractors play in creating effective and evidence-based policy, because that seems to be one of the higher leverage outputs that Gryphon Scientific can have, is influencing the design and implementation of policy at a national scale.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. So I would say before I joined Gryphon, I did not understand the machination of federal governments. And, the US government is unique from other governments in certain ways. I think sort of Western democracy, especially Western English-speaking democracy, tends to have certain trends, right? So what I'm going to tell you about is not necessarily the way that it works everywhere. But one thing that really I didn't understand, and I didn't believe it was the opposite, but I didn't really understand how many times U.S. government employees consult experts. It happens all the time. That the U.S. government is not motivated to just close rank and build policy that is not supported by experts and voices. The political sphere is very different than the rest of government. So there is an element of politics, but that's a small, very vanishingly small minority of the federal space. When you move away from politics, you really move into the realm of experts. And in the U.S. government, the U.S. government in any given place generally doesn't have enough work to keep experienced experts busy all the time. That any given federal office may need to call upon, I'm just going to throw out a number for illustration purposes, a dozen experts, but they don't have enough work to keep 12 experts busy all the time. And so that's where contracting really comes in, where the benefit of contracting is the government can buy a slice of time from an institution that holds the expertise needed to solve the particular challenge that they're facing. And then when that challenge is solved, if they need expertise in some other area, they can go buy fractional slices of time there. And then on the flip side, one really great thing that I like about my work, which is not necessarily something that everybody loves, one thing that really I like is I can work for this client, solve this problem. The project ends, and then I'm going to go work for this other client on this other problem, and I get to work on something, it's all life science related, which is nice, but it can be a totally different question, right? And you get to start the problem all over and start from the drawing board to figure out how to break it down. And so both sides benefit the other. And I would say that there's innumerable opportunities to get involved in policymaking. The challenge is figuring out how to get started. And my experience really is looking at the federal government that once you're inside the fold, it's much easier to move around. And so if you're really interested in doing this kind of work, find one institution that you think you could be happy at for some time, or a couple institutions, right? Apply to several jobs among institutions you think you might be interested in working for. And when you get there and you get to see the space inside of government, you may find that there are, actually, I really want to work for a think tank because I really like the kind of work that they do, or I really want to work for an advocacy organization, or I really want to work for, there's different organizations that we engage with all the time that are working on similar issues, but talk to slightly different people, have slightly different approaches. And it's relatively easy once you're inside to wait for the opportunity to slide over there until everyone kind of gets to where they want to be.
Interesting. So you previously mentioned that you're starting to look a little bit more at the effects of AI on biosecurity and biosafety. Is this sort of one of those examples where, because you are already in the government sort of contracting space, you are able to focus your attentions on that, and like you're able to sort of reach across sort of to the more AI specific things because you already had that basis of experience basically with government work?
Yeah, we got involved in the AI work because the federal government trusts our opinion on biosecurity issues. That when a new technology comes along and it could have an influence on biosecurity, they trust us to quickly scope and focus their attention on what really matters. We are not AI experts. We have data scientists on staff who are, well, I should say, I am not an AI expert. Most of us at Gryphon are life scientists. We're also not AI developers. So we have AI experts, but we're not AI developers. So, we didn't come in saying, we know everything about AI. Here's the whole scope of the problem. We could say, given these tools and the way that we see them working, these are the risks that we see, and this is where you should focus your attention, right? And the government can then turn to the AI developers and say, what do you think of this? And so it's not about overselling your expertise. It's not about playing in fields that you don't actually know anything about. It's about being trusted for what you really do know and really can speak to. And the AI space has been a wild ride, and I mean that as a positive thing, where it's one of those technologies that like really wasn't there until it was just everywhere. Like it was almost overnight compared to most technologies where no one had heard of ChatGPT, and then it was like in every newspaper everywhere, and everyone was using it, and all these AI assistants came out, and like the technology just continues to spiral and spiral, and everybody knows that too. So it's a gold mine in the commercial space. It's a massive amount of attention is being placed on it in the federal space in every way you can imagine, right? How do we mitigate the risks of this technology? How do we ensure that this technology is used for the good of mankind? How do we foster its growth so that we can get the economic benefit of having an AI industry without stifling it with too many regulations? And What's been really fun about it is there's almost only one side. Like everyone is into it. Everyone wants it to be the best thing that it can be, right? You're not showing up in rooms and arguing with people about who believe the opposite of what you believe, right? Generally, everyone kind of believes the same thing, and we're all aligned around a similar vision, even if the aspect of that vision that we're working on specifically is different. And I've never seen a community go from, in our analytical policy community, I've never seen a community go from so small to so huge so quickly. And we've just been hanging on and having fun participating in those discussions.
I can only imagine, yeah. When it comes to these sorts of discussions where it's, you've described kind of the model of government politicians creating policy as being the job of governments is basically to know how to get policies passed, and like once they're sort of already formed. But then there's a formation stage where they're actually consulting on experts and getting outside opinions from people who have much higher levels of knowledge and expertise on a specific topic. And that sort of then feeds back into this policy engine inside government, which knows how to then actually get that passed. Where do technologists, such as engineers and such as life scientists, fit in on this sort of spectrum of, at one end, you have policies being passed in government, and the other end, you have fundamental sort of scientific research. Where do the technologists sort of fit in on that scale and in that pathway?
That's a great question. So I think there's a number of places that you could fit in, depending on where your interests lie. Right, everything from a subject matter expert in an industry-focused advocacy organization focused on one narrow technology and trying to assist government in understanding that technology and steering it toward a particular direction, to the opposite extreme that comes to mind as being a congressional staffer, where a congressperson in the US has 4 staff, 5 staff, 6 staff that have to cover the gamut of issues. So you are like the science person, not the science and technology person, right? You're not the life science person. You're not the synthetic biology person. You're not the AI person. You're the science and technology person. And your objective is to have sort of a scientific and engineering mind and understand how to talk to other scientists and engineers about technologies and quickly gather the information so that you can summarize it to someone who has their attention divided 30 ways and needs to know what needs to be done immediately to move this issue forward. For us, we're in between, where we don't focus on particular technologies, but we also don't focus on the breadth of science and technology. We focus on deep dives into specific technologies, specific issues of interest to specific people at specific times. And our approach is to bring the heavy technical analysis into the conversation and pride ourselves at contributing only what we know and what we can not necessarily prove, but support with evidence, right? So when people come and say, well, what's going to happen with AI and biosecurity? Or let me make a broader example. If people come and say, what's going to happen with AI and the life sciences? We can say, well, here's what we know about AI and biosecurity. Here's what we know about AI's use in the laboratory. But if you want to talk to us about the influence of AI technology on society and on the breadth of people across the nation or across the globe, like that's not really where our analytical skills lie. You would need someone else to answer that question. But there are groups out there that are experts in that question who use a different set of analyses, a different set of experiences, a different set of facts in order to help government reach that question. So, going back to what I said before, I think that an engineering brain is incredibly useful at assisting government to help government develop policies. But the form of your day job and the issues that you're working on vary based on the span of the organization that you're working for. And, it's not easy to figure out, across how many dimensions of interest and topics and work skills and everything is exactly where you want to be, right? I left the laboratory. I joined Gryphon. I've been there for 10 years. I love it. I got really lucky. The first place I found turned out to be the kind of work that I really wanted to do. But if you're interested in science, engineering, technology, policy challenges, get started. As I said, find one organization or a couple of organizations or many organizations you might want to start at. And it is totally normal to be there for 2 years and then jump to something else that you think might be a closer fit, and work there for 3 years and then jump somewhere else that might fit you better. Or maybe you decide after trying to influence government, you want to be inside government, and you shift from being outside of government to inside of government, and then you're called to find the other. And it's all of that is normal, all of that is expected, and you really have the freedom, at least in the United States, which is what I can really speak to find your niche and find the style of work that really gets you going.
How do you recommend people sort of search for those organizations to begin with? So what sort of organization should they be looking for? If they're looking on like LinkedIn or websites, what are their key terms, key search terms, key sorts of jobs or work that those organizations are doing? Because I can imagine it's at times organizations don't necessarily disclose that they're doing a lot of work with government. They may be like prevented from doing that for different confidentiality reasons. So are there any recommendations you'd have sort of around finding those first couple of organizations to get interested in and apply to?
Yeah, a couple pieces of advice. So first, searching for X policy organization should get you a couple of hits that can get you started, and you can search around that and try to broaden your scope. Think tanks are one common term that you can use to find organizations. Think tanks have a little bit of a different business model than we do, but it's similar, and it's a place to get started. An NGO is another one. So NGOs are often advocacy organizations or nonprofits that work on policy issues. You can find a lot of those. The third way, and I don't know, once again, unfortunately, I know the US story. Maybe something similar exists elsewhere, but the United States government has a site called usaspending.gov. And what you can do is you can go in there and you can search by keyword, and the keyword searches are pretty good. So pick an agency that you think does work that would be related to the kind of stuff you'd want to do. Search for some keywords. It'll pull you up the contracts and grants that agency has issued over the last time period, and you can click on those and you can see who was awarded those contracts, and you can go find those organizations and see what they do. Not a lot of people know about that site, but the U.S. government is pretty transparent when it comes to spending, and it's you can learn a lot about organizations that way. And once you find an organization that might be interesting, you can invert it, right? So you can say, okay, I really want to work for Department of Homeland Security on emerging technology policy. Okay, there's this company, Gryphon Scientific. What do they do? Okay, now give me all contracts that Gryphon Scientific has won. Now I can see the body of work that they do. Okay, interesting. Now I can see if it's something I want to do.
That's really fascinating. I didn't know that existed at all. That's a really helpful tool for career planning.
It is cool. If you want to support the photo mission, it really can't be beat. Last thing I'll also say to all your listeners, if you're interested in getting in a way to figure this out and you're not sure where to start, send me a message on LinkedIn. I am happy to have a conversation with you and point you in the right direction.
That's great. That's extremely generous of you. I'll have a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes page for this episode. So I guess before we sort of wrap up, I'm curious if there are any promising technologies for improving biosecurity defense that you're particularly excited about, that are kind of, I guess, more horizon or nascent at the moment, or that you think could be big in the next 5 to 10 years?
I'll give you 2 examples. So AI is going to be huge, and we're working really hard to make sure that it's used for good. But I think the potential there is sort of just possible to imagine, in a really literal sense. Every time I interact with new members of the AI community, there's some new application that I hadn't thought of that could have a huge benefit. So to give you a couple of examples, Um, there's a couple companies now that are working on making fully automated scientists, where the AI conducts experiments, analyzes the results, develops hypotheses, develops new experiments to test those hypotheses, executes those experiments, and then sees the results. I think for a long time, humans are going to need to be in that loop because it's going to be pretty hard. Like, it takes many, many years to teach a human how to come up with good hypotheses. I think the same thing will be true with machines. And of course, humans are going to be steering those machines for the foreseeable future toward the particular areas we want them to investigate. But the ability, like, almost every scientist I can think of is limited by how fast they can move their hands and how many hours they can stay awake, right? And AI is not limited by either of those things, right? They can just keep going and going and going. So sort of every scientific application imaginable is potentially achievable by that kind of system, which is really super interesting. The other example that the sort of broad set of technologies is, COVID was a horrible thing in so many ways for just about everybody. But the lessons learned from COVID, I think, are going to hugely accelerate our ability to detect, prevent, respond to biological incidents. And I will say that, biosecurity is the prevention of intentional harm caused by biological materials. But once the biological material is out there, it doesn't really matter whether a person did that on purpose or it just came out of nature. So the technologies that can be developed can help support biosecurity, but also pandemic preparedness generally. And there's, COVID brought in a whole range of people to focus on pandemic preparedness that weren't there before. And we're seeing this renaissance of ideas in pandemic preparedness. So just to give you one example, there's a huge interest in the deployment of newly engineered UV lamps in critical locations in order to disinfect large spaces, even air spaces, in order to prevent the ongoing transmission of disease. We're involved in assessment of a technology that is a UV lamp that is not harmful to people, but is particularly good at disinfecting surfaces in the air. And so the idea is you can put these in rooms where multiple people might be. You might have the potential that if you're having a meeting in that room, say, if one person is infected with a respiratory illness, even though they may be emitting virus into the air, the UV lamp is doing enough to prevent anyone else in that room from getting infected. And if we can interrupt the transmission chains of respiratory diseases, or any disease really, right, it substantially reduces the negative impact they could have on people. So that's just one example, but there's a lot of others. Engineering better PPE, understanding how better to communicate to individuals around biological risks, the humongous kickstart that RNA-based vaccines have given to the infectious disease community. We're now, we're simply replacing the RNA sequence of COVID with something from another virus, packaging it and launching it allows you to humongously accelerate the development of vaccines, and that's only really the surface of what I think is to come.
Yeah, some great examples there for sure. We did an episode on far UVC lamps previously as well with somebody from Convergent Research. So if people are interested in learning a bit more about that, I'll plug that here as well. I'm curious, with the advent of AI and the way you sort of see it changing the space, I'm curious if you've thought a bit about where you're like, what skills should people be building to sort of remain competitive in that space? So sort of if you assume that AI is going to do a lot of the things that humans are currently doing to some degree in our lifetimes in any case, where do you, or how do we keep our sort of competitive edge in that field as professionals and as sort of technical people? How do we sort of stay competitive there? I'm curious if you've put any thought towards that.
Yeah, it's a thought experiment that I run a lot, and part of the answer really depends on how we decide to implement AI at the real detailed level. That are we going to let AI take our jobs and then all do new jobs? Are we going to let AI take our jobs and have more time to do other things. I don't know. And that's sort of way outside my area of expertise. I can't even project where that'll happen. But I think the hardest thing to teach a machine to do, well, let me take a step back. I'll say the human brain compared to computers is slow, right? We already have computers that can do things that are just orders and orders of magnitude faster than what a human brain can do. But the human brain has been evolved to do really well that no silicon-based system is able to do yet, is take in everything around it, determine what is important for what it's focusing on, determine the patterns underlying that, from there develop a creative solution to whatever challenge it's facing, and then bring that solution to life. That sort of pan knowledge ability, the ultimate flexibility and the ultimate creativity of the human mind, I think is something we're not going to be able to see AI take on for quite a while. And when it does, right, then we're into science fiction land, because then we have AIs doing things that, essentially equivalent to people. So I would say, focus on pursuits that entail creativity, that entail innovation. Right, we're seeing AIs create art. Right, they're doing a great job of producing art, but it is 100% derivative. Right, there's no creativity involved in that. It's sort of integrating everything that it sees in art and generates more examples of that. And I think that's going to be true across industries. And the good news is that, engineers are really just highly refined, highly experienced, practiced, and formalized creative and innovative thinkers. So I think engineering and the applications of engineering and engineering thinking is going to be one of the last things that AI touches.
That's an interesting and reassuring take. I think the other thing for me is, in a world where there's kind of AI generated content, images, speech, text, videos, even, the one thing that is not going to be able to replace is human, sort of the human touch of, like, if you're sitting in an auditorium and watching a real physical person standing at the front of the room giving a speech, I can imagine that it's going to be really, really hard to recreate that level of connection to something that's synthetic in the terms of just being audio or video or some sort of AI generated content from that perspective. So I think for me, one of the opportunities that if people are concerned about where they fit in amongst AI, is maintaining that ability to have human interactions in a professional setting. If you're specifically thinking about, how do you think about this in terms of your career planning? So I guess getting good at having conversations and presenting and sort of being able to communicate and interact with people in that way seems important. Even over video call like we're doing at the moment, it's still a different experience to if you were just watching an AI generated video, even if that were in real time, I think.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Those human interaction skills are going to be something late to the AI game, and they're useful in almost any career field you can imagine.
Yep, definitely valuable.
I think going back to your example of someone sitting on stage and giving a speech, even though there's a speaker who's talking to many, it's still not a one-way relationship, right? That the power of that human interaction is the power of the speaker to understand the audience and adapt, pick up on the emotional swells and the feelings of the audience. And it's going to take a lot more add-ons to AI for them to be able to understand humans in real time and respond accordingly.
Yeah, definitely. Right, as we're wrapping up here, I guess, is there anything else you wanted to mention, to return on and sort of elaborate on further?
No, nothing comes to mind. This has been a really fun, far-ranging conversation for me.
That's great to hear. I guess for people who are more interested in learning about biosafety, biosecurity, and sort of biotechnologies in general, have you got three sort of top resources that you would recommend them look into?
We have an organization that we love to collaborate with called NTI. They are the Nuclear Threat Institute. That's what that stands for. So they started with a focus on preventing nuclear holocaust, but they've expanded into bio, and they work on a lot of the similar questions that we do. But because they are an NGO and they work publicly, not at the behest of governments, they get to talk about everything they do openly and publicly to a greater degree than we can. So I really like pointing people to their resource on both on biosafety, biosecurity, and biotechnology and those interrelationships. It's a great place to get started.
Awesome. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. What do you wish you had invented and why?
I will say I wish I had invented. So my 10 years that I spent as a scientist was interesting because the scientific enterprise is about determining to absolute granularity what causes what. And so a lot of the work that you're focused on is making sure that you're controlling for every variable that you can. So you're only testing one variable at a time, right? Fundamental principle of the scientific method, really. But what I found was some of the things that seem to be just totally trivial turn out to be majorly meaningful in causing the effect that I'm observing. And we're finding that all the time in research now, where things are not reproducible as you move them from one lab to the other. And my hypothesis is that as the scientific, I know about the life sciences, I should say, but in the life sciences, we sort of fundamentally described the mountainous level cause and effects, right? And we're working our way down to the smaller and smaller effects, the more complex effects. As we get to those smaller and smaller things, there's the way that we move our hands or the ambient temperature of the laboratory, which can be really different in one part of the world versus the other, turn out to be meaningful in results. And I see an attempt now in technology to build support systems for scientific research that can track more of these variables in an automated way for folks. Everything from AR glasses that you wear that have cameras on them that track everything you do in the experiment and then outline it for you so that you can see in this case you pipetted in a different direction than you did before. Maybe that is meaningful. And so I wish I had worked on and invented systems to approach that question, because I think in a couple of technology generations, if those systems are uptaken by scientists, you're going to see this rocket improvement in the reproducibility of science, and that's going to dramatically increase the throughput.
Yeah, I think that'd be an incredible upgrade to the way we do science. Because I know for my PhD experiments, I was working in a water tunnel, and so I would change the speed of the water tunnel to do the experiments that I was running, and so I would have to turn it up with enough time to let it sort of return to this steady state of operation before I even started collecting any experimental data. And if you turn the speed of the tunnel down at any point, you basically have to wait for a long time for that effect, sort of sloshing effect, to settle down. And then, questions of different sort of temperatures and atmosphere. So we had a temperature controlled lab, but there's all these tiny little things that you wouldn't even think about if it weren't for, I guess, decades worth of people having found out the hard way that these things need to be controlled and need to be thought about.
And it is the hard way, right? Where I would discover things that were deeply meaningful in my results, and I would say to my colleagues, I figured this out. And they'd be like, oh yeah, we knew that. And nobody remembers to tell everyone or writes these things down. So we're all discovering them over and over again. And if we could just better control for all of that and spread that knowledge, we would save a lot of time.
Yeah. I was doing some frequency-based acquisition, and you could Like, I knew to look for the frequency of our electrical grid and the frequency of the pump that I was using in the tunnel. But had I not known to do that and had nobody sort of flagged that to me, I probably would have got really excited about seeing this interesting like frequency peak at 32 hertz or whatever it was that I was running the pump at.
Yeah.
It's little things like that which, yeah, you just need somebody to tell you about. Otherwise, you'll get too excited too quickly.
Yeah.
Well, great. So if people want to learn more about you, your work, and Gryphon Scientific, where are the best places online for them to do so?
Yep, we have our website, gryphonscientific.com. Explains a lot of what we do and how we go about our work. And LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. It's the place where I'm most active. And as I mentioned before, feel free to send me a message. Most of our senior folks are also on LinkedIn. So if there's someone else's portfolio that's of interest to you and you'd like to hear more, feel free to shoot them a message too. Most of us are happy to talk.
Terrific. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for joining me today and taking some time out of your schedule to have a chat.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate the invite.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ryan. I certainly did. It was fascinating to learn more about the role that consultants can play in the government sort of decision-making apparatus. For detailed show notes and valuable resources related to this episode, head to engineeredforimpact.show/Ryan. That's RYAN. You can support the show by leaving us feedback on the show notes page for this episode or sharing it with a friend or colleague. Thanks for listening and happy problem solving.